Today we're talking about the perfect node tree inside of DaVinci Resolve, more specifically the perfect node tree for your workflow, how you can build one yourself, and why it is the biggest lie ever. So let's get to it. So in order for me to get my point across about why the perfect node tree is a myth and a lie at the same time, I must first talk a little bit about what a node tree is supposed to be in the first place. So a node tree in color grading is supposed to be a sequence or order of color manipulation techniques used after one another that provide you with the best results for your specific clip and your specific scenario. In my honest opinion, the reason I think it's worth it to genuinely have a sit down with yourself and think about these things is because if there were such a thing as a perfect node tree, what that would mean ultimately, by extension, that would mean that there's a perfect order in which you have to color grade your footage. However, you would be very quick to realize that there is no such thing as a perfect universal blueprint for every single use case out there. So ultimately, the perfect node tree for your specific use case is going to depend on two factors. Number one is obviously the kind of circumstances that you recorded your footage in. And the second factor that's going to influence the node tree for your specific needs is obviously your knowledge in color science and color theory. But in practice, how do these two factors actually materialize? Well, let's see. So right here, I have a very carefully color graded clip. As you can see, this color grade consisted of 46 nodes. But the interesting thing about this is that I absolutely did not use all 46 of them. 46 is way too much. But why do you think my node tree consists of 46 nodes when in reality you would be fine in 99% of cases with, let's say, just 10 to 15? Naturally, the reason was these two very factors that I just told you about earlier. So just a little backstory, I was actually creating a book when I was creating this node tree for myself, and I needed a very efficient way that accounts for most of the scenarios that I recorded my footage in. So across a 100+ page book, you would be actually correct to assume that there must have been an extremely diverse set of weather and lighting conditions, and I needed to find an efficient way to go through all of them. The past few years, I've seen a very odd, super weird fascination with overcomplicating your node tree to appear smarter, or I don't know what the reason is, obviously done by videographers and colorists alike. Looking at this node tree, you might assume the same thing, that I'm just trying to make it as complicated as possible to appear as smart as possible, but that is absolutely not the case here. So even though my node tree may seem as complicated and sophisticated upon first inspection, it is very easy to understand and very easy to follow. So I'm going to break it down for you right now. The reason it would be very helpful for you to humbly and honestly assess your genuine level of color grading knowledge in terms of color science and color theory is that if you do it any other way, it could very quickly go wrong. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the more sophisticated you try to make your node tree thinking that it's going to help you without having the color theory and color science knowledge in the first place, the more lost you're going to be within your own node tree. And obviously you don't want that to happen. As it was for me, when I started developing my very own node tree, the first step for me was to humbly and honestly admit that I'm not perfect and that I still have a lot to learn. And even today, I still have a lot to learn, but also to accept that there's no such thing as the perfect node tree. And I do not want to be sold on somebody's 500 euro power grade because it doesn't work. And just so that you know, this very first step of just becoming humble and admitting that I'm not perfect and I have a lot to learn sent me down a 2 or 3 year rabbit hole of learning as much as I can about color, of learning as much as I can about digital color grading, but it has helped me so much. I genuinely cannot tell you how happy I am about the transformation that I went through. So when I created my first power grade, I felt so happy about myself, even though it was just a 5-6 node color tree. It was nothing complicated. It was the most simple thing ever. But the reason I felt so happy about it is because it was my own and it was always to the best of my knowledge at the current time. Obviously, every single time I created a power grade, I felt relieved and very happy, not because I thought that what I had created at the time is the smartest or best thing ever or the best power grade, but because I had created something myself that perfectly represents my current level of color grading knowledge at the time. Naturally, over time, this goes through a massive transformation. So the more you learn about color, the more you learn about color perception, the more you learn about color theory and color science, the more complicated things you can include in your node tree that are not complicated to you anymore, but might be complicated to a beginner, let's say. And over time, you're going to go from 5 nodes to, let's say, 10, to 15, to 20, to 25, and then basically this can go to infinity. However, across your journey in the next 2 or 3 years, there are always going to be moments where you're just going to stop and think to yourself, okay, there is actually a more efficient way, a more optimized way I can do this, and I can reduce my nodes from 25 to, let's say, 15. And this is exactly when I would say that you're making genuine progress. So a very big advice I could give you is to not stress too much about the node tree itself, because I might have 46 nodes here, but realistically, I could have just used 15. So why did I not use 15? For this very specific use case of color grading 200 images for a book from a diverse set of conditions, a 46 node tree might actually be the best because this accounts for all 200 of them. Certainly, this is not the perfect node tree for everyone and for every use case, but for this use case, this is what works. So I would say this is about time we actually start showing you how you can create a node tree for yourself. So the first step is always to consider these two factors that I told you about. So the conditions surrounding your recording and your level of knowledge. So right off the bat, a very big misconception about color grading as a whole is that beginners tend to think that it's actually the node tree that dictates your color grading workflow. But it's actually the other way around. Your node tree does not define how you approach color. It's actually your color knowledge that defines it. A node tree is merely just a consequence of your color knowledge, if you get what I mean. So a very helpful step for you would be to genuinely assess how much you know about color science and color theory, and try to think how you would approach color as a thought process. So for myself, based on my experience with color so far throughout the years, I developed a 5-step mental process. And these very 5 steps for me are the following. Number 1, you have basic adjustments. Basic adjustments, for anyone who doesn't know, is pretty much nothing more than just exposure and contrast. So the second step for me is always color balance. So pretty much pushing my colors to a neutral state where I can think of and assess what my next step is going to be. And my next step is number 3, color harmony. Think of color harmony as the relationship between all of the various colors that appear within your image and how they relate to one another. Step number 4 for me is color contrast, which is pretty much just amplifying the color harmony that we just introduced into our image. And the last step for me is always color perception. It's very easy for you to color grade things on a digital backlit screen, but at some point you have to understand that our eyes work very differently than, for example, the scopes inside of DaVinci Resolve. So you have to account for this. So imagine a max brightness and max vividness green color here, and imagine a max brightness and max vividness color red right here. According to the scopes, these two colors are supposed to be of equal brightness, but this is just not how it is in real life. Like, due to the kinds of receptors we have in our eyes, red colors are way darker for us than, for example, green and yellow. And in step number 5, you're supposed to account for these inconsistencies. If you are recording with a camera that is capable of recording either a log profile or in a raw codec, I highly recommend that you work color managed. Working color managed is nothing more than simply doing your color grading workflow through an intermediary color space. The reason this is helpful for us is because each camera manufacturer has different types of preferences and settings for their own cameras and color science, in a sense. And what color grading color managed does is account for these inconsistencies so that matching cameras and matching looks is easy for you. So what that really looks like is just 2 nodes. You have an input transform and you have an output transform. In my specific case, I like using an ACES transform, and this footage was recorded using Sony. On this second node, you're also going to want to use an ACES transform. You're going to put in your intermediary as the inputs, and you're going to transform it into Rec 709 BT1886. This is my preferred workflow. A very useful step in my color grading transformation was to take advantage of parallel mixers. So an example would look something like this. Let's assume that you would like to add 2 nodes after your input transform, and then you connect them up like you would. And if you actually use a parallel mixer, what you're going to be able to notice is that this does actually allow you to make multiple transformations at the same time. For example, if I plug this back into my output transform, I can, lift my image, I can apply contrast at the same time. Because all of this is happening at the same time, right? Like this is not happening after one another. So pretty much you can think of this node tree as the perfect representation of your mental model. For example, I told you about my 5-step mental model for color grading. This is going to perfectly mimic that. So we have my input transform, we have my basic adjustments, but by the way, this could be as many nodes as you need. And then the next one would obviously be color balance, because that's number 2 for me. So I'm just going to add 2 nodes. And pretty much you're going to want to follow the same pattern. So for me, normally it's always enough to color balance my image in 2 nodes. You connect them using a layer mixer, you connect it to your output transform. And here, obviously, you can do your balancing. You just go into gamma, linear. You can do your color balancing, nothing too crazy. For this, you would obviously want to use a vector scope to find the perfect middle ground for your white speck. This is going to be about right 99.9% of the time. So do not overcomplicate color grading workflows. Basic adjustments, color balance, and then the next one is obviously color harmony. Color harmony is where it starts to get confusing. I would like to make videos about this in the future, but for the sake of simplicity now, I'm just going to show you what I prefer to do. However, what you have to know is that this is a very broad topic. There are quite a few color harmonies to tackle your image. What I would like to tell you right now is that complementary colors and split toning is not the only way to tackle color harmony. You know, many people, they just prefer using a single node of this little plugin right here called the split tone. I prefer to do something else. For my specific use case, I like to use a mix of linear gamma transformations and timeline gamma transformations. So this is why it's important that you select the part that you need. You might only want to color grade the highs. You can select them carefully right here. And on the second one, you can obviously do the opposite and just select the lows. Yeah, you can target specific areas. You can introduce colors as you wish. It is not rocket science, but there are so many ways of going about this. This is as far as I would go in terms of simplicity. Next step for me is to introduce a few nodes of maybe vignettes. So let's say I'm gonna add 3. The basic idea is that not everything can be done in a single node. So you would actually want to use separate nodes for this. For example, on this one, I might wanna use a circular node. I wanna make it larger. I wanna make it also inverted, and I wanna decrease my exposure using this right here. On the second one, I would like to use a gradient one, starting from the bottom, making my image darker. And on the next one, I would like to do the same thing, but the opposite. And the reason you want to do this on separate nodes is because you want to use different strengths. So you cannot use the same strength for everything. Connecting them up using a parallel mixer is the best idea. Now, obviously, right now, I'm not focusing on the color grade itself. If you actually were to focus on this, it would look a lot more specific and a lot more tailored to your specific liking. But we are just really showing you the idea. So let's continue. So after you're done introducing color contrast into your image, the last step that you would have to do is to account for color perceptual inconsistencies. Now let's imagine for a second that I have a lot of light yellows, let's say, which is an extremely bright color, and a lot of blues in my image, which is extremely dark. And even though they're at different brightness levels because we perceive them differently, they might still have the same saturation. So you might want to take attention away from one of them at least. So what you might do is as follows. You might look at your image and say, oh my God, these blues are not the way I wanted them to be. I did not want them to be this distracting. I wanted the yellows to pop out more. So what I'm going to do is 2 options. You can either choose to decrease the brightness or decrease the saturation of the blues. Obviously, you could do this the most simple way possible. Just use your qualifiers, qualify the blues, roughly soften it out because you want a gradual transformation, make it a bit wider so that you really catch all of them. You can use, the normal saturation tool. You can decrease exposure using the HDR global slider. These would be very good examples of perceptual color fixes. And if you're still not happy with your selection, obviously you can just do denoise. So that's going to help you a lot. And pretty much the basic idea is this. You don't have to use a lot of nodes. All you really need is as follows. You need your transformation node. You have to do your entire color grading in between. You have to have a combination of maybe 1 or 2 nodes, or sometimes even more for every single step that you would like to do within your color grade. As you can see here, I have basic adjustments, color balance, color harmony, color contrast, and color perceptual fixes. This is my way of thinking. This is my train of thought. And this is pretty much how I approach color. Now, depending on the use case, depending on the scenario, depending on the conditions that you recorded your footage in, It might require a node tree of 45 nodes. It might require a node tree of 10 nodes. It really depends on the complexity of your goals and on the conditions that you really recorded the footage in. So that's the basic idea. So that is pretty much all you have to know about node trees as a whole. And I hope that this video showed you that it doesn't matter and you shouldn't stress too much on node trees as a whole. What you should be more focused on is how much you know about colors and what your thought process is approaching colors as a whole. So I really hope that this video showed you that it's not worth it to stress too much about node trees as a whole, and it's way more worth it to stress about the knowledge, because your knowledge is going to define your color grading workflow, and a node tree is just the consequence of that. A node tree is not the defining factor in how you approach color grading as a whole. So that's it for this one. If you have any ideas for future videos, I would really love to help everyone out. I would really love to make helpful videos for everyone. So if you have anything, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll see you in the next one.